All right, now officially, hello everybody and welcome. Welcome to NIO Berlin 2022, welcome to the Tempodrom and welcome to Seats. My name is Christian Wiegand, I'm the head of user development for NIO in Germany. And I'm very proud and super happy having the chance to guide you through the next couple of seconds, or even minutes. But what is Seats? For those of you who are not familiar with the format, let me just quickly introduce it. Seats is a NIO original knowledge sharing platform where ideas and inspirations are sparked. Back in 2015, it was originally established as a more internal sharing platform for employees. But pretty soon it actually turned public. And now it's a very incremental part of our NIO community and our community work. We have already executed more than 1,000 seats in across 50 cities. And we had already above 1 million people joining Seats as an audience on and offline. So that was an obvious decision then to also bring Seats here into the environment of NIO Berlin 2022. So for today, we are more than thrilled and super happy to have 3 great minds here that will share in a bit their ideas and their knowledge with you guys. To start, let me introduce our first speaker, Dan Seabird. Dan is a senior partner at Foster & Partner, one of the most famous global studios for sustainable architecture, urbanism, engineering and design. Funded by Norman Foster in 1967, Foster & Partners contributed to the world a large number of very significant and outstanding architectural works. Today, Dan will share how big data can help to address one of the most challenges or biggest challenging tasks of our age, climate change. So please join me in welcoming Dan on stage.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Christian. So, look, it's great to be here. It's great to be here at the NIO event. I'm going to start just sort of talking a little bit about us to put a bit of context into the sort of wider conversation. So, you know us probably quite well in terms of doing buildings. We've done quite a famous building in this city, quite interestingly. A couple of buildings that we've done this year. But we also do infrastructure, and this is where it gets really interesting. We're doing infrastructure because this is the glue that knits cities together. This is what actually creates cities, but also at every scale. What we're really interested in is design at all scales. So we also do products. We do pieces that focus on people and how human beings use our work and use our architecture. I'm going to start with a little bit of data about us. I thought we'll keep cutting into data sets as we look through this. So we're about 1,800 people overall, and we're worldwide as a business, which is kind of really interesting. So it gives us a real interesting perspective on climate change, on how to work around the world, and how actually to influence things. There's 2 key things I think worth talking about within the DNA of Foster & Partners as we sort of see a film of our studio behind us. The first is we don't really trust the idea of sketching and some beautiful sketch the architect will produce. What we're really interested in is lots of voices contributing to the design process. So analysis, voices, the more of that we can get, the better we feel we'll understand the complex problems of design. The second key point, really, really interesting, is technology. We were known originally as a high-tech firm. That has sort of kept going in some sense, but it's also moved into how we work, the processes of how we work. So think of us in some sense as a tech company, which is quite interesting, but we really believe in the positive effect of technology, that we can improve people's lives through using technology. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those processes and some of how that influences how we see the world of architecture, how we see how we might affect climate change within what we do. I put this one up. Beautiful cars outside, and we've been looking at those, but there's also some key differences, similarities between the processes of the automotive industry and what we're doing. I'd say we look at the car outside, we're thinking that is the end of an incredible process. It's very, very refined. It's been through dozens of prototypes. Everything about it has been understood. The data set of the car is incredibly complete in some sense. And the alternative, in some sense, is the building. The building, yes, there's bits of it which continue. There's bits of it which have continuity through experience, but in reality, every time you approach a new site, a new place, you're really starting from scratch, and the building, to a certain extent, acts as a prototype. So we can see these things as rather different. We'll come back to it in a bit. And this is probably, I'm going to throw some data at you today. So the built environment, 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So ultimately, an incredibly serious part of how we affect climate change, whether we do it correctly, and what we're going to be doing. I thought I'd sort of start with this slide. This is what we need to do to keep it to 1.5 degrees. But it's also, if you will remember when you were at school, we were talking about a carbon cycle, that it's a relationship between absorption and emission. And that will sit beneath it all. I'm going to try and introduce you to a new concept, which I'm going to say is the data cycle. Okay? This is really the relationship that we have between, actually I'll go back, sorry. So the relationship that we have between how we design, how we construct, and how we really put data into the middle of all this. The key piece for us, I think, to understand is that sustainability is now a data business. It is a data set, ultimately. We need to make decisions. We need to make decisions as a community. We all need to actually see what we're doing. But the nature of what we're doing is incredibly complex. So to do that, we are really dealing with, as Christian said, big data. We're dealing with the whole built environment, the projects that we do, and how we really utilize those to understand the architectural piece better. So I'm going to start off, in some sense, with design. And I'll put this little data tool up, which I think is quite interesting. So this is at the first stage of design. And I think what's interesting at the first stage of design is we can make the most difference. So when we're positioning things on the site, when we're beginning to design buildings, we can make the most difference from a sustainable point of view. When we're going later on, we're sort of bolting things in, it's much, much less significant in terms of the overall. And this beautiful little tool that we're seeing here is called Sandbox, and it's really, I'm going to describe it as a sort of architect's version of Minecraft, where effectively what we can use is, within this tool, a real-time data set, so we can modify things on the site, and then we can read out from there the data set of what we're doing. So we can position something on the site, and we can say to ourselves, it's doing this, it's approximately doing this, probably. And that gives us a much better sense when we're designing stuff as to how the whole piece is going to work. Interestingly enough, it should also be virtual, so you can get inside it. You can see we're using virtual tools. We were sitting in a virtual environment in the cars outside as well, which I thought was fascinating. So we're going to start off with this. This is a master plan in Milan. I'm going to go through a number of projects, and each time I go through a project, we'll just look at a tool that relates to those projects. So this first one, this is in Milan, and I'm going to click quickly into a video really of how we're using this tool within this master plan. So it's all designed within this one tool. So you're positioning mass, and you're getting area readout and this kind of thing, and you're understanding what you're doing. So, but more than that, you can interface with a live environment. And that live environment gives you the ability to not only look at how it's performing here from a solar point of view, how much daylight is getting to different parts of the master plan, but also we can begin to get more interesting data sets out of it. What we can begin to get at this stage is, in fact, an entire carbon readout of the project. Within balance, I would say. We'll come to why within balance in a minute. So that becomes really, really interesting. So we can look at this kind of data set, we can look at these kind of tools, and that gives us an ability to judge what we're doing from that point of view, but also from a point of view as to where we are as human beings. And we'll come into the next one. I would say, what do I really enjoy? One of the things I really enjoy is making a difference in parts of the world that you can do really big things. And this is Amaravati. This is a provincial capital in India. And here we can say, if we get our minds around that idea that performance-based design is a really interesting piece, we can do it in real time. How do we do that? And what we're doing here is we're looking, again, at the overall, this really large-scale piece of land, this provincial capital, and we have a sequence of performance indicators. And that sequence of performance indicators are actually established by the provincial government. They're established by the people in India looking at how they want their city to work. And that for me becomes really interesting, because it becomes a thing about how do you get widespread community support and engagement into a piece, and then what you're really doing is you're testing, as you see it, each time a whole sequence of different performance indicators in relationship to that. So I think hopefully you're beginning to see this idea that you've got a sort of performance-based design thing, and you can throw lots of options at it, and you can see what it's doing, you can analyze what it's doing, and you can begin to get from that a really interesting piece of design. So now we're going to get a little bit more advanced. We're still in the early stages of design, but as we said, one of the things about this is how many options do you want to do? And this is Guangming. This is a transport hub in China, in Shenzhen, that we did about a year ago. It's really interesting, as I said. And what becomes fascinating here is how can we use more complex computing within this? We've got to look at lots of options. So within this piece of work, what we're actually getting is we're combining those performance ideas with a genetic algorithm. So the genetic algorithm is giving us an ability to take on all the heavy lifting of our data set. So this will look, and as we can begin to see, it's effectively looking at the green space in the middle, views from that, it's looking at connectivity, it's looking at overall energy usage, and it's beginning to give us a version of life where it will effectively refine 30,000 solutions for us over time in a way that gives us something to start. And to do that, what we do is we tie in many of the computers in our office into a wider data piece so we can actually get that kind of computing power. We think it's really interesting. This sort of idea that we hand to the computer the ability to do the heavy lifting. So, what are we trying to do? And I'm going to use this as a little segue. We know this is our fundamental piece. Once we've gone from that overall perspective of the large scale, the many options, how do we begin to look at a site? We're now going into what are we really trying to do with the buildings? And to get to where we need to be, we really need to be into sort of near net zero, but also at about 50% embodied carbon. And for any of you who don't quite get what embodied carbon is, that's the carbon that we're spending in building the building in the first place. So it's effectively the concrete, the steel, the wood, whatever we're bringing along, that is the embodied carbon. So we not only need to look at what we're doing in use, we also need to be looking at how we construct the building and what are we doing for that. And that becomes then my next tool that I'm going to introduce you to. So this is sort of, I would say, one of my key ideas, which hopefully we can place today. Think about here design, but could be any one of your processes, as a carbon-based workflow. You're very used to doing things in terms of money. You're very used to saying, this will cost me so much. Think about the same thing in relationship to carbon. All I've got to do is I've got to get down here, I've got to get to 1.5 degrees. That's the plan. So how each project can be judged on the basis of can it get to 1.5 degrees. So we're going to look quickly at this. This is Stockholm Central Station. And it's effectively a building that's re-knitting in a part of the city. So a very historic railway cutting that's coming in, and we're effectively building over the top of that railway cutting to re-knit part of the city. And this is then a really, to me, we're in the next stage of design. We're looking at things in a much more complex way at this point, hopefully. There we go, so the video will run. Okay. So, at this point, we have a much more detailed model about what we're doing. And here, in real time, we're looking at exactly how much carbon is being used in the final project. So we're looking at the last stages of design, and we're saying, okay, what material choices can we make, and how will they affect what the overall use of carbon on that building will be? In this case, so you can see that effectively a readout of carbon in this bottom corner constantly coming through. So we're beginning to, I hope, get a sense that these projects can be seen in some sense as a carbon data set in their own right. Okay? What's critical about this, and this will be towards the second part of my seed talk, is this information is not universal. So the carbon that we use is related to where the project is, because it's related to how much energy we've used to transport stuff to the site. It's related to the grid within each country. So if I'm designing somewhere where there's an incredible hydroelectric piece, ultimately the embodied carbon of what I'm doing is less than if I'm designing somewhere where there's heavy coal-based power. So that idea of the relationship between a place and the data set is absolutely critical, and that gets tied up into this stuff. Okay, so we're going to finally go into construction. And I think this is where I think this part of the data cycle becomes really interesting, because this is where we're most different, I would say, from the automotive industry, and problematically so. What we really need is to be able to grab data from the built work, from what's happening on these buildings, but that is never ever really happening in a traditional sense, in terms of we hand the building over, people think the architect has finished, and ultimately what we need to be doing is taking that data from the buildings that we produce and dragging that data back into this cycle so we understand better what we're doing. So I'm going to introduce you to Spot. You may not have seen Spot before. So Spot is a Boston Dynamics robot, and here this is our project in Battersea Power Station. It's a residential project, and Spot is walking around. But what Spot's doing is really quite interesting, because Spot is effectively converting the physical into digital. So the data set of the physical world is being taken, it's being transferred, it's being digitized, and then we get to read what we've built directly, and we can compare it to what we designed, but more importantly, we actually have a virtual copy of the physical world, which becomes, as I said, really interesting. We then took Spot to our office, as we'll see. We gave Spot one of our security passes, which was good fun. And as I said, Spot became part of the team in that kind of way. And this was a collaboration that we did with Boston Dynamics as to how to use this kind of robot. It could be a drone, it could be a robot, but effectively ways of utilizing technology to take the physical into the virtual. And in some sense, for the last two parts of this talk, this seed talk, I'm going to concentrate on that little piece, the use piece. Okay, so I don't know whether any of you understand the word digital twin. We'll try and talk about it, and I might go through this video a couple of times just so we can. So digital twin is the idea of creating a really, really proper virtual copy of the physical world. So you have a digital twin here of our office, and we've created this digital twin of our office in Battersea, London. And within that, you have all the data that you need. And you can use that data. It needs to be updated constantly. Really interesting as a concept. You begin to think about it. So it is an exact match of the physical world itself. I'll go back because I think it's quite a fun one. And then some of the things that I think are really interesting when we begin to look at this are simply these ideas. I can click on something and I can read the embodied carbon of the chair. I can think about how the performance of the overall office is working. I can understand how that is over time. But all this piece creates a vast amount of data. And this is where I think perhaps maybe getting to the crux of this as a seed talk, is this idea that really buildings, systems, our industry really is becoming really only about this data set, this idea of where this is, how do we utilize it, how do we bring it forwards. And this is, I guess, my final of the tools that I'm looking at, maybe the most important one, interesting enough, although it probably looks the most boring for the, and this is really an analysis of the entire portfolio of Foster projects, all of them read as a data set. So this is, and where people get very excited about this is in finance, because I've been in plenty of meetings with lots of financiers recently. Almost all building projects now are related to green finance. And by that, what they're looking for is some kind of data that they can back up how they're going to fund that project. And so here, this ultimately becomes why a project will go forwards. Okay, so there's my final piece, ultimately, of this seed talk, which is to look at that idea of a data cycle, that idea that you have the ability to channel data from a building, from a construction project, as it goes forward. I actually started at the beginning. Was it the beginning? It's quite interesting. This sort of idea, really, that I could have started at the other end. I could have started with the digital twin and gone back, all the way back through the cycle to actually start back at the beginning, back into that first point about how it comes. The last point I'm going to sort of mention to you, where this becomes interesting, is who has the data. So, the world we live in creates vast amounts of data. It creates vast amounts of data that we need, as you probably see, for sustainable design. We need it for sustainability overall. And how do we utilize that data when we don't necessarily have open source for that data? So it's a really interesting idea, I think, for all of you, for the end of this seed talk, really, is who owns the data of sustainability? Okay, so that's the end of my seed talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for this great presentation and all these great insights. Very impressive. That was seats number 1. We do a quick break now. Whenever you have any questions to Dan, please feel free to approach him. He will be around and happy to answer whatever you want to know. So we do the break of roughly 20 minutes and meet back here in the small arena at 4:20. Thank you very much.